Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be going on a deep dive into something that might sound kind of dry at first: public debt and exchange rates.
But it's actually really fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. Trust me, folks, it gets really interesting. So the basis for today's deep dive is a 2011 paper from the Canadian Journal of Economics.
Yeah, it's called The Structure of Public Debt and the Choice of Exchange Rate Regime.
And basically what we're going to unpack today is how the way a country structures its debt, like what currency it's in, how it adjusts for things like inflation, all that stuff.
Yeah, all of that impacts their choice of exchange rate regime, so whether they go with a fixed rate or let it float.
Exactly. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to impress your friends with your knowledge of why some countries just cling to these fixed exchange rates.
Right, it's this phenomenon we call fear of floating, and a lot of it comes down to how much debt they have and what kind of debt it is.
Okay, so to set the scene a little bit, you're probably familiar with the basic trade-off when a country's choosing an exchange rate, right?
Sure, yeah, on the one hand, you've got fixed exchange rates. They offer stability and credibility, which is really appealing to a lot of countries.
Right, it makes things predictable. But the downside is that it limits a country's ability to, react if there's a sudden economic shock.
Exactly. They lose some flexibility. So then on the other side, you've got these flexible exchange rates that can adjust to those shocks. Roll with the punches, so to speak.
But they can also be pretty volatile, right? Like unpredictable.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that makes a lot of countries nervous. Especially, we tend to see this fear of floating more often in developing countries. They really try to manage their exchange rates very carefully, even if they technically have a floating regime.
Interesting. So they're not really letting it float freely, more like a managed float. So, I mean, the big question is why? Why are they so afraid of letting go?
Well, this is where the whole debt thing comes in. The paper argues that the type of debt a country has really matters when they're making this decision about their exchange rate.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects now. So it's not just about picking fixed or floating. It's about how that choice interacts with the kind of debt you have, kind of like a double-edged sword situation.
Exactly. And the paper digs into three main types of debt. So we've got nominal debt, index debt, and then foreign debt.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. Nominal debt, that's the most straightforward one, right?
Yeah, it's basically debt that's fixed in the country's own currency. So if a country's currency is pesos, their nominal debt would be in pesos. The catch is that it loses value if there's inflation.
Right, because inflation erodes the purchasing power of money over time. So even if you owe the same number of pesos, those pesos don't buy as much as they used to.
Exactly. And this can actually create a bit of a tricky situation for governments because they might be tempted to try and inflate their way out of debt, print more money to reduce the value of what they owe.
But that can lead to a whole host of other economic problems, can it?
Oh, absolutely. Too much inflation is definitely not a good thing. So then you've got index debt, which tries to solve that problem.
Index debt, that's the one that adjusts for inflation, right?
Right. So it basically protects the real value of the debt. No matter what happens with inflation, you're still going to owe the same amount in real terms.
So index debt is kind of like the safe bet in a world where prices are always changing.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It takes away that incentive for governments to, mess around with inflation to lower their debt burden.
Makes sense. But now let's talk about foreign debt. This is where I feel like things get really interesting because now we're adding exchange rate risk on top of everything else.
Right, because now you're not just dealing with your own country's currency and inflation. You're also at the mercy of what's happening with the exchange rate between your currency and the one you borrowed in.
So if a country borrows in US dollars, but their income is in pesos, things could get pretty ugly if the peso weakens against the dollar, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Suddenly they owe a lot more just because the exchange rate shifted. It's like this hidden cost that can really sneak up on you.
And that's what you were talking about earlier with the whole fear of floating thing.
Exactly. These valuation effects are one of the big reasons why countries, especially those with a lot of foreign debt, might be terrified of letting their currency float freely. They're trying to avoid getting slammed by those sudden shifts in exchange rates.
Makes total sense. So they stick with a fixed exchange rate, even if it means giving up some flexibility.
Exactly. And we've actually seen this play out in real life, right? Countries like Argentina and Brazil, they've had their fair share of challenges because of this.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And Turkey, too. They've all faced these issues with foreign debt and exchange rate fluctuations. It can get pretty messy.
Wow, so this isn't just some theoretical concept. It's a real-world problem that countries are grappling with. It makes you wonder, is the system kind of rigged against developing countries? Like, are they forced to take on more foreign debt because they can't borrow in their own currencies?
Well, there's actually a term for that. It's called original sin. And it basically describes this situation where developing countries have a really hard time borrowing in their own currencies.
Original sin, that's a pretty heavy term. I mean, it does make you think. But maybe that's a conversation for another deep dive. Okay, so we've talked about these different types of debt and how foreign debt especially can make countries really sensitive to those exchange rate swings.
Right.
So to really dig into this idea of choosing the right exchange rate regime, the paper sets up this kind of hypothetical situation
Yeah, like a thought experiment.
where you have a country with perfect credibility. So basically, everyone trusts them completely. They always do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah, that's the assumption. Perfect credibility.
And then they look at what happens in that ideal world if you have a fixed exchange rate, so like a peg,
Uh-huh.
versus, if you let the exchange rate float. So what did they find? What works best in that perfect world scenario?
Well, it turns out that if a country has a lot of foreign debt, a credible peg, so a fixed exchange rate that everyone believes in, is actually the best option.
Really? Even though you lose some of that flexibility to respond to economic shocks?
Yeah, because remember, a fixed exchange rate helps you avoid those big valuation effects. So if you've got a ton of foreign debt, that stability is really, really valuable.
Okay, that makes sense. You're basically trying to protect yourself from those sudden shifts in exchange rates that could make your debt a lot harder to repay. But what if a country doesn't have that much foreign debt? Like, what's the best strategy for them?
In that case, a credible float, so a floating exchange rate that people trust, is actually the better option because it gives you more flexibility to deal with any domestic economic issues that might pop up.
So there's this kind of trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Like if you've got a lot of foreign debt, a fixed exchange rate looks pretty good because it offers that stability, but you're giving up some control over your own economy.
Right.
But if you don't have much foreign debt, a floating rate gives you that flexibility, but you're more exposed to those exchange rate risks.
Exactly. It all comes down to this trade-off between stability and flexibility.
And it really highlights how a country's specific circumstances and debt structure really matter when they're making this decision. But let's be real. Most countries don't have perfect credibility. Like governments change, policies change, sometimes promises get broken. So what happens to this whole debate when you factor in that lack of trust?
That's a great question. And it's where things get really interesting. The paper actually goes on to explore what happens if the fixed exchange rate isn't fully credible. So basically, people aren't 100% sure that the government is actually going to stick to it.
And I'm guessing that changes things quite a bit.
Oh, yeah, it does. The results are actually pretty surprising.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What changes when you introduce this element of doubt? Like when that trust isn't quite there?
Well, the big takeaway is that if a country has a lot of foreign debt and their fixed exchange rate isn't seen as completely credible, it actually makes that peg less attractive.
Wait, hold on. So the very thing that was supposed to make a fixed rate safer, avoiding those exchange rate swings,
Yeah.
it actually makes it more risky when people don't fully trust the government to stick to it. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
I know, right? It is. But think about it from the government's perspective for a second. Let's say they're in a tough spot economically, things aren't going so well.
Uh-huh.
If they're stuck with a fixed exchange rate that everyone's doubting anyway, they don't have a lot of options. But if they abandon the peg and let their currency depreciate, it actually makes their debt a little bit easier to manage.
So it's like a way to get some breathing room,
Exactly.
but it also means breaking your promise on the exchange rate
Right, which further undermines your credibility.
and makes it even harder to maintain a stable exchange rate in the future.
Yeah, it can become a bit of a vicious cycle. That lack of credibility makes a country more likely to abandon a fixed exchange rate in times of trouble, which then makes people even less likely to trust them next time.
It's a tough situation to be in. So for countries that are trying to figure out what to do about their exchange rate, what's the big takeaway from all of this? What should they be thinking about? So, it sounds like what we've learned here is that choosing between a fixed and a floating exchange rate, it's way more complicated than it might seem at first.
Oh yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of decision.
Especially when you bring in all these other factors like how much debt a country has. And especially that whole idea of trust or credibility, like the economists call it. It sounds like that's a key takeaway here, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, credibility is absolutely crucial because what we see from this paper, right, is that without it, even if you've got a fixed exchange rate, it can't really deliver that stability that you're looking for.
Right, right.
And if a country has a lot of foreign debt, on top of that lack of credibility, well, that just makes everything even worse.
It's like walk a tightrope while you're carrying a heavy backpack. One wrong step and you're in trouble.
Exactly. The weight of that debt just makes you that much more vulnerable.
Yeah. It's interesting though cuz this whole model it focuses on national debt, right?
Uh-huh.
But it makes you wonder like how much do these same ideas apply to our own personal finances?
That's a really good question. Like, do our personal debts, things like mortgages, student loans?
Yeah. Yeah. Or even like credit card debt, which, we all have a little bit of, right?
Right. So how much do all those things, all those debts, influence how we react when the economy changes?
Think about it. Like if inflation goes way up and you've got a lot of debt, you're going to feel a lot more pressure, right?
Oh, for sure.
To maybe ask for a raise or pick up a side hustle or something just to keep up with all those payments. Or what if the stock market crashes? Are you going to think twice about making a big purchase if you're already carrying a lot of debt?
Exactly. It's like you're less likely to take risks, or maybe you'll even cut back on spending just to be sure you can keep up with everything.
Right, right. So it seems like, this idea that debt can really influence how we react to economic changes. It applies it to like both the individual and the national level. So for you all listening out there, the next time you're trying to make a financial decision, whether it's a big one or a small one, just take a minute and think about how much your debt might be shaping your choices.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to be mindful of because whether you realize it or not, it's probably playing a bigger role than you think.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into public debt and exchange rates. We've covered a lot of ground today, from those different types of debt to that whole concept of credibility and how all those things can really impact a country's choice between a fixed and a floating exchange rate. But what I think is really interesting is how some of those same ideas can even apply to our own personal finances.
Exactly.
So hopefully you've all learned something new today, and maybe you've even gained some insights that you can use to make smarter financial decisions in your own lives.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, right?
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating deep dive.